So I want to start off just now and thank all the presenters today. I hope that people in the audience are excited by what they saw today. I know Harris & Harris Group is a unique and different type of company than most. You know, we moved this event down to the New York Genome Center because I think it stands for a little more of what we do as a company than a Midtown law office, which are beautiful, and the art on the walls probably costs more than our entire employee salary in a given year. So this is a little more telling of what we do at Harris & Harris Group, very deep science work. So I hope you were engaged by it. I think these companies really have a chance to fundamentally change their markets, and I think they are disruptive. I also want to make one more call to draw blood in the back. If you're a shareholder of Harris & Harris Group, I'm not even going to take your question today unless I see that you've drawn blood. So please draw blood, and I know there will be a lot of questions at the shareholder meeting today. So to conclude the morning session, we at Harris & Harris Group wanted to describe how we are thinking about precision health and medicine and how we're thinking about that developing market. We describe the plan, as you see here, as epitome. This is sort of the word we've been using to describe it. Epitome is after the 16th century writings of the physician Andreas Vesalius. Those of you that took basic high school biology or an anatomy course probably came across the images that he made famous. He basically peeled from skin to organs to the skeleton. You could peel them off and see each layer below what was happening in the organ systems of the body. And we think of epitome in Harris & Harris Group of unpeeling the chemical and biochemical levels below that to really enable precision health and medicine as we go forward. Our goal is to be able to collect, process, and deliver information that supports more personal, precise, and predictive health decisions. You've all seen the safe harbor statement before. So let's start at the beginning. So Harris & Harris Group's identified a market that we believe is about to experience disruption. We've developed a plan to realize value in this market. Why we decided to focus on precision health and medicine? Well, 30 years of venture capital and thinking about everything we've done since 2002 in nanotechnology really led us to believe that major wealth is accumulated when there are major market or industry changes. So the simple way to think about that is think about the change in value in American companies that internet-based companies are doing. Right? 20, 30 years ago, you'd never think of these companies being some of the most valuable companies in the world, but they are. Great wealth is accumulated when there's market and industry changes. You see that in venture capital going back, something like 95% of all wealth in venture capital created by 5 or 6 different disruptions in the space. So you want to be in a market that is being disrupted, that is being changed. Second, we spent about 8 years already looking at precision health and medicine, and our involvement has provided insights that lead us to believe that this opportunity provides the way to build a railroad. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but a railroad to a new healthcare future. So we have a market that's going to be disrupted, and we have an execution plan. And I think the big part is many of the components are already in place. You heard from Metabolon, you heard from Origin today. There are other components that we've put in place that we think can enable this healthcare railroad. So I think the obvious question is, well, why do you think healthcare is going to be fundamentally changed over the next set of years? And I think very simply it's because it's not all that effective. It's not as evidence-based as you may be led to believe. And I think we're running into a problem with American sustainability in it. So let's talk about non-effective. According to the Journal of Patient Safety, over 440,000 preventable deaths in hospitals occur each year. This costs the system over $20 billion. I like to think of it as you're more likely to go into a hospital healthy and come out dead than you are to get hit by a car in this world. There are 700,000 serious drug reactions each year. And even though we have 100 pharmacogenomic tests, which could prevent some of this, doctors only use those pharmacogenomic tests in 20% of the cases. So we have information that's not being used out there. And according to Severin Schwan, who was one-time CEO of Roche, to quote him, this is from the pharmaceutical industry, half of all diseases can be considered untreatable, and the other half, drugs only work half the time and with serious side effects. Let's talk about the evidence-based side of it. I mentioned that doctors only do tests for 100 prescriptions that have pharmacogenomic information 20% of the time. That's scary. What's even scarier, there are 6,000 prescription drugs on the market today. So we have for the vast majority of these medications, we actually don't know how individuals will fully respond to them. And our work with Metabolon has shown sometimes the difference in responses across individuals. Some of them can be very damaging. Major diagnoses are missed in 1 in 5 patients. According to the Institute of Medicine itself, valid scientific evidence supports well below half of the practice of medicine. And it's estimated that it takes 17 years before research advances in medicine become part of clinical practice. So today, we go to the hospital, 2016, we think we're practicing, breakthroughs that just occurred. In some cases, we may be, but in a lot of cases, we're practicing research breakthroughs from 1999. So there's a huge lag in the system from the breakthroughs to when you see it in medical practice. I think the 6 bullets here show you clearly that it's not sustainable. As an example, in the US, chronic disease affects more than 140 million individuals. 7 out of 10 mortalities are related to chronic disease in the US. It accounts for 80% of our healthcare budget. That's over $2 trillion in chronic diseases in America. On top of that, almost 3 in 4 individuals age 65 or above have multiple chronic conditions. Now let's add to the fact that 69% of adults and 28% of children are overweight and obese. And I think you can see we have a healthcare system that at the very least is being strained and is probably not sustainable into the future. And then we get to top all of that off with the fact that the US spends 40% more per capita in healthcare than any other nation in the world. So I think you get an idea of how we view the healthcare system currently. I think that the famous physician author Robert Wachter summed it up the best by saying, quote, "The system delivers evidence-based care only about half the time. It kills a jumbo jet worth of patients each day from medical mistakes, and it is bankrupting the country." We could spend some more time regaling you on the terrifying sort of facts coming out of the medical world, but I think that all of us would agree that the promise of precision medicine is certainly not being met currently. But I think change is coming, and I think it's coming rapidly, which means that we need to move with alacrity. Domestic policies are forcing institutional change. They're causing this massive disruption. But on top of that, you have changing demographics. You have new data becoming available. So in the future, I believe that data will drive interpretation, and this interpretation will lead to better health outcomes. So again, that's important. Data will drive interpretation, and interpretation will lead to better health outcomes. I think this leads to our opportunity at Harris & Harris Group. So what's missing in the system today? There are a tremendous amount of companies out there in the precision health and precision medicine space, but I think there's 2 key factors that we spend a lot of time looking for. 1, access to data that is specific to the individual. So you just heard Robin and Origin talk about what are they doing when they draw your blood. They're getting access to individual information, and it's not just DNA information, it's the context around that DNA in your cell. So we have companies like Origin, company in the genetic space, NGX Bio, already operating in this space. The second thing is information engine that can interrogate across health data types and transport actionable information from the individual to the clinic. That's what Interome and that's what Muse's lab, also in our portfolio, are doing currently. So in summary, Harris & Harris Group's identified the fundamental components. I think we've gathered the key pieces of the system to take advantage of this disruptive period and accelerate the adoption of precision health and medicine. And just stepping back 1 second, change in healthcare is never easy and it's never fast. Couple of anecdotes. 1816, the stethoscope was invented. Took 20 years to be generally accepted. And every doctor wears today. Even better, this is my favorite. In 1848, Dr. Semmelweis suggested hand washing might actually reduce mortalities. Doctors revolted. Even in 1990, there was strong opposition to ultrasound during pregnancy, something that anybody that has gone through birth recently knows is just a core piece of what we do all the time. So if we're to be successful, we need to take the components, build a massive healthcare railroad, and realize value in this coming disruption. So let's turn to our plan. I'm going to digress for a few minutes and discuss the formation of the great American railroad monopoly. Our team at Harris & Harris Group was very excited when I first came through, and I stopped reading science books and I started reading on the American railroad system. But it's truly a phenomenal and amazing system, and I think it creates a lot of good analogies to how we look going forward. So this is the railroad system of 1830. It was small and fragmented. Routes went 10 to 50 miles, often to nowhere. Trains couldn't run on the same tracks because there were 24 different gauge sizes. That's the width of a track. 24 different gauge sizes. So the trains couldn't even run on the same tracks. And even if you got a train on the same gauge, the same width, chances are the cars didn't connect because all the cars had different connectors on them as well. So resources were underutilized because access wasn't organized. Turn to 1850s. Railroad system of 1850 was beginning to connect and offer greater access. But as you see in this picture, by the different colors for track, there was still no interoperability, no standard gauge sizes, and the railroad remained fragmented. So let's turn forward to 1878 and then to 1890. The 24 different gauge sizes were now standardized, and the car connectors were standardized. The U.S., the West Coast and the East Coast was now connected because in 1869 in Promontory Point, Utah, you had the Golden Spike Lane connecting the United States by railroad. Transportation hubs could be developed. Cash crops. Cash crops did not exist. You couldn't ship them anywhere. Now cash crops could be shipped from the breadbasket of the Midwest to the population centers on the East Coast. Timber from the West, minerals from the Mountain West were delivered where they could be utilized. Railroad towns across the country, most famously in Chicago, were developed. And the interesting thing, and we'll come back to this a couple times, this analogy is Chicago. I know there's some people from Chicago here today. Chicago had a monopoly on the railroads. Almost all trains going east to west started and stopped in Chicago. You stopped, you got on a transport controlled by the railroad, you went to a hotel controlled by the railroad, they fed you a dinner controlled by the railroad, and they put you on a train the next day at a different location just so they could make money across that whole area and take a toll from you. So now we had a railroad by 1878, 1890, transportation system that drove America's economy and made it a preeminent leader for over 40 years through World War I. But it took 50 years to standardize the railroad and create that powerful system of transportation. And I posit the same will be here at Precision Health and Medicine. We'll be here 20 years from now talking about the promise of precision medicine because it'll be decentralized, everything that's great about America, but it won't get standardized. And medicine, as you're going to see in a second, needs to be standardized. We need to get on a railroad if we're going to make this a reality in a shorter time frame, and we think we can do that. So let's turn to what we've started calling the United States of healthcare. And let's think of healthcare similar to the railroad. The railroads transported people, timber, minerals, and cash crops across the country to population centers. It connected the country. Precision Health Railroad is similar, except it's transporting information. It's better, it's transporting information. It has consumers. We put them on the West Coast. It has payers, those that collect the premiums and pay the bills and are hoping not to go bankrupt into the future. It has the technologies that provide health and medical information. It has pharmaceutical firms that want access to the information that's traveling across the tracks to help drive their drug discovery programs. It has a regulatory regime similar to Chicago, so we placed it in Chicago, where everything passing through will need to go through the FDA if it's ever going to enter the clinic. And then clearly we have the clinical applications that are hoping to use this new information in their treatment from everything from fertility to neonatal, from early age through chronic diseases and the ages and the diseases of age to treat them more effectively. And I think most of you know this, but this is not a small industry, the United States of healthcare. It's $3 trillion with over 300 million consumers in it. So let's look at some of these components quickly. First, we're going to look at the consumer. There's a few important concepts in this presentation. I think this is one of them that you need to take home today because it's important for healthcare. Precision health and medicine will not become a reality until we have collected multiple different types of data across large data cohorts, across populations as you see above, and we've analyzed it so we can use that sample of many to inform a sample of one, that one being you. So we need that data. We need what Origin's doing. We need not just DNA data, but we need cellular data with the context of it if this is to be successful. The large cohort data doesn't really exist currently, except for some small firms like Origin and others. Our belief is that companies that own this access may very well own the railroad at the end of the day. So a logical question, is the consumer ready to play in this? You read a lot, you hear a lot in the medical profession that we're not really ready to do all of this. You go in and you ask your doctor, tell them I want to be sequenced. You might get the question of what is DNA? right? You're certainly going to get the question, if I have no idea what whole genome sequencing is when you go to see your doctor. But I don't think that's really true. And I think there's some data that supports that we, the consumer, are actually ready for this. So in a 2010 trial of a program called Open Notes, it was done in 3 sites. Boston, actually the middle of Pennsylvania, not one of the city centers. It was done through Geisinger in Pennsylvania, and then Seattle. Results demonstrated that 87% of the patients actually opened these open notes to look at the conversations happening between the doctor of them and contribute to them. And at the conclusion, 99% of the patients wanted those programs to continue. In 2013, 4 million of Kaiser Permanente's 9.1 million members were active users of their My Health Manager app. So they were actively engaging, working with the digital technology to learn about their healthcare, talk about doctor's notes, contribute to it. More than 8 of 10 Americans have looked up health-related questions on the internet. Well over 25% of Americans are tracking at least one health parameter by mobile app, and 75% of them say they're willing to share that information anonymously. And a study of 3,000 individuals at Scripps, published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Eric Topol's group at Scripps, found that there was no evidence of psychological harm or sustained anxiety from receiving consumer genomic assessments, which is something you often hear in the industry. So I want to spend a little bit more time on the consumer. I want to look at some of the different consumer populations because I think this is going to be important. So we're going to zoom in first on the baby boomers. Baby boomers. Probably a lot of you here today are baby boomers. A lot of our shareholders, they might even be past the baby boomers. But this is a large population. It's matched only by millennial populations in size. This is a population that is peaking for medical spending, as you see in this graph here. They have watched their own parents fight chronic disorders. They've survived cancer, live with Alzheimer's, and they want a better system for themselves, and they can afford it. Let's look at Generation X for a second. 36 is the age at which the vagaries of youth turn to the thoughts of age. It's the first big health decisions usually manifest themselves for a population now generally referred to as Generation X. Again, Generation X have watched their family members, oftentimes their parents, live with cancer, survive with cancer sometimes. They know that information is available, they know where to go get it, and it's often not going to a medical practice to get that information. And we'll turn to the millennials. Millennials are just different. They're different in so many ways. They are so comfortable with their electronics, almost as comfortable with their electronics as they are with humanity. They want efficiency in healthcare. They are willing to share information. They are less interested in a relationship with a physician than in getting more effective service that meets their time schedule. Just for a second, I'm going to move through some of these now. Let's turn to the payers. Payers worry about this system going bankrupt. They crave information that will better inform their healthcare decisions. They look for more efficient ways for healthcare to be delivered. In the long term, they're the beneficiaries if we can solve this problem. So we believe in the short term, they actually may contribute and provide a revenue stream that aids this whole railroad in its early days. I'm going to turn to clinical applications. As I said earlier, we don't see the true realization of precision medicine until data across large patient cohorts can be interrogated, which will lead to the interpretation that can provide clinically actionable information. Even then, unless there's a way to communicate this information across multiple providers and multiple practices, precision medicine will lag. So let me give you an example of that. A person 65 years of age or older in this room, on average, has 7 health providers across 4 systems. Not only do those systems not communicate, oftentimes, so even if you have the information, it's often not communicated across those systems, so that the doctor in one system is not going to be as well informed as you, the patient, are, because they don't have all of the data, all of the health records, all of the information, all of the tests that were run in another system. Once we have large cohorts of data, once we have a system that is interoperable, now we have the ability to share that information, to use that information both in health and in medicine. I'm going to turn to pharma. Pharma, I think, is going to become one of the most important early players in this precision health and medicine railroad. Pharma is willing to pay for aggregated information, not just interpretable information, which is what you're going to need in a clinic, but aggregated information long before it is clinically interpreted. So we believe there's revenue streams to be had. And just in the early days of precision health and medicine, pharma has proven themselves to pay handily to get this aggregated information. So like the payers, I think that pharma can be an early source of revenue stream. And as Origin is showing, I think the consumer can be an early revenue stream as well. As they get engaged, they've shown themselves willing to take this information, learn from this information, and it's certainly a wonderful education for them. So I'm going to turn to regulation. We placed regulation in Chicago because all access to the clinic will be controlled by the FDA and the clinicians, similar to the cross-country transport being controlled by Chicago. But there's a big difference in healthcare versus the American Railroad. The American Railroad, I could transport timber across the country, and I could deliver raw timber to Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. And some craftsperson there made a table, a bureau, or a chair. But in healthcare, I can't do that, right? So first of all, the timber's not on all large public lands or anything like that. It's owned by the individual. As I transport it, I have to add value. So think of the railroad of older generations, that as that timber crossed the country, it got turned into chairs, bureaus, beds, tables, so that it was delivered on the East Coast, you had the end finished product. The interesting thing about healthcare is healthcare requires clinically actionable information. And unless you take that data, interrogate it, and lead to interpretable information, it's not getting through Chicago. It's going to be stuck in Chicago. And that's critical. So that's why we think of regulation in Chicago. I think the other take-home message is that individuals own their information, and the bridge to the clinic will not be complete until the large data cohorts exist. So they have to exist to validate the clinical practice, and the FDA is going to rule here. And finally, the technology. I'm going to spend a few minutes on the technologies. These are the source of information that will enable precision health and medicine. This slide demonstrates the type of information that will ultimately be available. Most of you know about genetics and the genome. John Riles in Metabolome spoke today about the metabolome. Some of you have heard about the microbiome, the microbes that contribute far more DNA in your system than you do. The epigenome, this is the regulatory structures. But there's also other things. Your family history, right, is part of that. The environment that you're exposed to is part of that. Your physiological information that you collect on your Fitbit. Imagine all of this information coming together to provide a real clear picture of you. That's the type of picture that's going to impact healthcare of the future. You can see down below here where we have some of the companies in this space. I just want to, again, digress for a second. I think it's important. Most people think of precision health and medicine, and they think of it as genomics. They think of it as a sequencing. Disease has not and it will not be predicted by genes alone. Our genes don't work in a vacuum. They are significantly influenced by the complex interactions of our diet, of our microbiome, of our stress, of our attitude, of our environment, of our socioeconomic status, believe it or not. Data without that context is meaningless. And I think Barry Marshall, the 2005 Nobel Prize winner, said it the best when he said, "Everything is environment until you convince me it's genetics." So again, the vision of the technology we picture is, imagine being able to use all of this technology, just not a few pieces of it, to really sort of unpeel the information that's going to provide you with the decisions you make, both for your health and when you get disease as well. So all these components together make up what we call the United States of healthcare. So let's just talk a little bit about the current state of the United States of healthcare. Well, we have new technologies. I think you saw them in what I just explained. They exist in our portfolio. Metabolon, Origin, Tara, Philogen, EcoPixel are all contributing to those technologies. We need to collect the large data sets that don't exist now, and I think companies like Origin and NGX Bio are doing that. Institutions have been driven to change, right? So the activation energy, those of you that know what activation energy has been met. The change is coming. The government has driven that, so that boat is off and running now, which I think is good for the timing of Harris and Harris Group. But the system's not interoperable, and there's really not an engine that allows you to interrogate across these current data sets currently. So in the current state of healthcare landscape, we believe that the railroad looks like 1830, not 1878. I think the goal is to not take 50 years to get there. And we think that probably two critical components that we still need is access to the data and then an engine that can interpret across that. So let me just talk a little bit about sort of the current state of it now as well. And these aren't entirely accurate, but I think they create a pretty nice picture. So Metabolon in our portfolio, brings a technology, metabolomics. It works with pharmaceutical companies, inborn errors of disease. It's actually made it to the clinic, so it's doing that. But it fights, and it's business. It needs large data sets. You see it going after these GWAS studies. But imagine if large data sets on the individual already existed. So it's part of the puzzle, but clearly there's more to the railroad. Look at a company like Origin. Origin, we're on the West Coast now. We have access to the consumer. They have information, the context of the cell itself. They're beginning to work with cardiologists and neurologists, so they're working across the system. But again, it's not a perfectly working system yet where you have everybody on an interoperable track, so we sort of drew that in different colors. NGX is working with genomic information to the pharma, but also working at the consumer level. And then you have an interoperability company, Fleet, in our portfolio that's working on sharing information across different medical systems, but it hasn't really branched out of that yet to take some of these technology and the consumer information. So you see all these different sort of tracks. And I think the vision we look at for the future is an engine and a train that can take this information, put it on tracks, and get information from the consumer, which is just starting to be gotten now, with the technologies, and move those across the country. And again, Interome and Muses Lab, a recent investment, are really companies focused on this application of being that engine that provides interpretable, value-add information that can be interpreted by the clinic and then moved on the far right to different clinical applications. I think that is the vision of what we're looking at. So let's look at that. We call the connected United States of healthcare. So again, what I see down the road is a single track, a single gauge. You have information from the consumers. You have all the technologies. I think many of them are interlinked. Many of our companies work together. Origin works with Metabolon and works with Tara. So some of these companies are linked. You have the technology. You have early payers that can help provide a revenue stream. You have early pharma that can provide a revenue stream. That information is put on a train, on an interoperable track. It's run across the country. It's interpreted by the engine so that in Chicago, now you can move that information to the clinic. And when you can do that, the promise of precision medicine will be met. I would argue even before that, for the consumer, the idea of precision health is becoming a reality. I can go to Metabolon, I can get my blood draw, I can get my whole genome sequence, and I probably have more information now than almost any medical practitioner has on me. I know drugs for pharmacogenomic interaction. I know that I, as an individual, am pushing the boundaries of being pre-diabetic. I know that my glucose level would probably put me as a pre-diabetic patient, but that actually I have a pretty good insulin resistance mechanism that sort of pushes me below that. But I also know that I'm on that line, I can watch it, and I can watch and see where I'm going over time. That's not what I get out of the medical community, and I think that the individuals are driving it. So I think there's a real opportunity in precision health ahead of the clinic, but the ultimate promise and how we're going to change healthcare, how we're going to make the system more sustainable is ultimately to be successful on that railroad and then get this information out to the clinic where it can be used in clinical applications, again, from fertility to neonatal to inborn errors of metabolism to cancers, to chronic diseases, to older diseases of Alzheimer's as well. That's our vision at Harrison Harris Group. I think we have many of the components in place, and that's what we're going to be working to do over the coming years. So we're building that railroad, and I just want to say thank you for being here today. Thank you for participating in this.